Welcome back to our panel discussion, Contextual Intelligence, Deciphering Disparate Data in Government, sponsored by MarkLogic on federalnewsradio.com and Federal News Radio 1500 AM. My guests today are Dave Rost, the subject matter expert on insider threats at MarkLogic, Gary Duno, the Director of Analysis at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, Stephen Buckner, the Assistant Director for Communications at the U.S. Census Bureau, and Neil Wiley, the Deputy Director for Analysis at the Defense Intelligence Agency. And before the break, we were talking with Gary about the idea of object-based production and use of the data for the domain that you're working in, which could be the entire country or it could be a much narrower, secretive domain, serving military and national security. And so I guess the question is, how do let's further discuss how you break down the silos within your domain and talk about some of the people and management aspects of that, and also the technologies that enable you to share information as far as you need to share it.
Right. So as with many challenges, the cultural issue is probably the hardest one to get over. And so, as I mentioned, historically, analysts, not just in our agency, but in all agencies, will look at a problem strictly from their perspective and build their solution and structure their data to answer their problems. What we're doing now is through training and tradecraft campaign with our folks, we're talking to them about how the data is applicable much broader than what they've been looking at. Most of our employees get that right off the bat. It's a matter of helping them find the structure that is useful for others and help us develop the tools that make it useful for others. And so we're working in our agency. We've developed what we call an application schema, which is the data standards that we apply to each of the pieces of data that we have. And we have a campaign through our efforts to achieve the object-based production end state that the Director of National Intelligence has put forth, by which our agency is responsible for geospatially enabling all intelligence data. What that means is everything happens someplace on the planet, right? Mm-hmm. So if we apply a longitude and latitude or proximity to a location or a place name, when we use our databases and we apply that, we're able to, no matter what the object is or the activity is, provide some context as to where it happened or where it's located. And that helps all the analysts across our community.
And so is what the agency puts out, is it primarily for use within the NGA and then you publish analysis, or do you also publish data to the intelligence and military components for them to do their own analysis?
So it's a combination. So we have folks, our analysts that work in my directorate are intelligence officers, and every day they're trying to solve difficult intelligence problems, primarily using geospatial imagery intelligence, and geospatial information to solve problems. But they don't limit themselves to that. They'll gather other sources and try to solve those problems. But at the same time, their observations, their data is sent out to other agencies such as Neil's, the Defense Intelligence Agency, or to the military services, or even to first responders in the case of a hurricane, to allow them to use that data to solve their problems.
So given the idea of object-based production and the application schema, it sounds like, to boil it down, data is becoming a commodity by itself that is not really tied to particular uses or applications.
Absolutely, and we want to make the data available to as many people as possible. One good example is we've had two activities in the last year or so, the Ebola outbreak in West Africa and the Nepal earthquake, where we stood up websites on the www enclave that have allowed us to put our data out in the open, which we have never done before, and allow first responders, allow social media, allow crowdsourcing to contribute to that data to be able to help people address those issues.
And Dave, let's zoom out for just a minute and give us an idea of what you're seeing across government on the agencies that you call in on with respect to how they're handling the silo issue, both culturally, as Gary said, and also technologically.
Yeah, as Gary correct, culture is the number one issue that stops it because the technology is there. As Neil said, there's the 80% analysts are spending time doing research, 20% of the time doing actual analytics. And what we're seeing is we're flipping that paradigm by implementing what is known as an operational data layer. It's where all the data is being fused into, tagged, and enriched even through natural language processing or correlating objects into a single data layer. That data layer then allows you to run multiple applications because each user or analyst has a different way of doing business, or inside the organization they have a different way of doing business, and inside a threat organization will look at data much differently than an NGA analyst will look at data. And we're seeing that the fusion of that data really flips that paradigm and allows users to get at that data and really find that context to it. And when we change from the owner of the data and creating a silo to an object-based approach, where the object is the data and all that data fuses and adds to that object, we're finding that it's better for the pedigree, provenance, and time span validity of that data, where now users can have multiple values to it. They can look at the data or the object in independent ways. Take for an example, in a healthcare example, a person is a patient, becomes an object. A physician will see that object in one way. He'll see all the attributes, see all the records, but an epidemiologist doing research of geographic-based trends and patterns will look at that object in a much different way, and will see it in a much different way because of access controls. In the same way a researcher researching trends will see it in a much different way.
So in a sense, it almost virtualizes the content of the data in such a way that it's available agnostically to different applications.
Exactly. It brings that data so that you can use it across the enterprise. It gets that ways so the users can access it from multiple pieces of information. It adds where you can add data to it easily without changing your data models. You don't have to re-engineer your entire infrastructure when you add a new source of data.
And Neil, you're nodding your head on that one, and you have a similar issue to Gary, I guess, in the sense that you don't share data with the public necessarily, but tell us what your issues are with respect to silos, breaking down silos, and getting the information to the people that need it, and that they can share with themselves.
Right. Well, I'm nodding my head because I'm in violent agreement with Gary and Dave. So as an all-source analytic agency, again, our view is that we are source agnostic about the basis for our analysis. So we consume everything we can from any source. So we rely very heavily on data collected by Gary's organization and other parts of the IC, and then from elsewhere, openly available information. So the real value of object-based production here, though, is whereas previously every collector, whether we collected the data or another agency collected the data, would store data in their own silos. Now, when they write that data, they write it to the object. So as Dave said, the object becomes where the analyst naturally gravitates to look for that information. So a lot of the organization, the collation, and the alignment of the data is done already by writing to that object. The other advantage is that by writing to an object, it creates almost an organic community of interest within the intelligence community on that particular object, because you have various IC analysts, whether for NGA, NSA, wherever, producing to that object. So you have a natural collaboration of analysts who are looking at that same object, perhaps from different ways. So there's a lot more richness involved in the analytic collaboration process, too, simply by organizing around that object.
But does that take the data away from being available to some other object?
Absolutely not, in fact. So, and part of the taxonomy and the ontology process that we talked about earlier for governance involves how we structure the data so that it is relevant to however many objects we set up, whether that's a person, whether it's a thing, whether it's an event or an activity. So the devil is in the details, but the details are very important about how rich and useful that data becomes.
It gets us back to the tank question, because the data about fuel could be useful to both the tank as a rolling war machine and the tank as a storage medium, could both use data about the same fuel.
Right, and that could be useful from a military perspective. That particular report about POL or fuel is relevant to the military capabilities analyst, who may in fact have an interest to know what the fuel state of a particular unit is, and of a logistics analyst to determine where in fact that POL has come from and what reserves they're at, or an infrastructure analyst to determine the piping or the mechanism by which an adversary may move fuel around. That same report's relevant to a whole bunch of different people who are looking at things from a slightly different way.
All right. So, Steve, now moving to the civilian side, you've got a totally different issue, sharing data with the public and also having people create products, that you may not be able to control out of the data. So what are your issues there with respect to sharing and silos and all of that?
So silos sometimes are viewed as a negative thing because it's very limiting.
Unless you're a corn farmer.
Unless you're, perhaps, yes. The silos were put into place because of the expertise of that particular analyst subject area, whatever it is, across the various agencies. They bring something very unique to the table. And for their perspective, their data item is exactly structured the way they need it. And when we're talking about either object data or just data as a whole, you have to think about it as an enterprise. And how do you create a shared services environment where that data can permeate across the silos, the vertical structures of your organization, and go horizontal? Because everybody's going to look at that piece of data individually different than the next person. And it doesn't mean that one person is not able to use it. It's just that if you structure the data better and put the metadata around it to define that object class, then others can use that for their purpose at the same rate. So it's really creating a more efficient organization from an enterprise standpoint if you can somehow bring people together to look at that information. So as you collect the data, it's a matter of how do you store it and how do people have access to it. And making sure that it meets all those criteria so that it becomes a benefit, whether it's from a structural standpoint in terms of the collection side of what we do at the Census Bureau or the dissemination side. So what we've been trying to do just from a communication standpoint is pull in all these different disparate data sets that exist around our interactions with the American public and the businesses. Mm-hmm. Not from a collection side, but how are they coming into the Census Bureau, either through the website or through the interaction of the data that they're trying to mine and use for some kind of decision-making process that they have. How do we actually pull all that information and then have a common schema that actually allows us to understand it? So if we have one call center in one part of the organization that is coding their interaction with a caller different than another call center, those data sets can't talk to each other. You have to really figure out how do you glue those two pieces together. So what we've tried to do is work on a common coding schema that allows us to be able to have that data collected in multiple different parts of the organization, but speak to the same data point so that then you can look at that data together across the different communications channels to have a much better and more rich picture of what's going on with the American public. You combine that with the survey data and all the information that's coming through, and now you're able to actually make better decisions about, if this area is having a low response rate, maybe there's something we can do on the ground to increase that response rate and get better data back in the hands of the local community, because ultimately that's what it's about for us at the census. How do we collect rich, quality data and get it back into the hands of the American public and the business community to help drive innovation, create jobs, make important decisions, or even answer a simple research question on a school paper?
Okay, so Dave, that sounds to me as if the era of the classic database administrator is, I'm just beginning to realize this, giving way to perhaps the chief data officer that we hear coming into federal agencies.
Yeah, the chief data officer role has become really taken off in the last 5 years as data continues to become more prevalent to organizations, and these data challenges keep rearing their head. And as the data officer, you really need to look holistically at your enterprise and say, what can I do to improve my organization? How do I improve, not just how my analysts and data consumers are doing it, but how do I minimize the cost of these databases? And one of the ways that you're doing that is when you have these individual databases, you have a data administrator for almost each one of those, or sometimes multiple data administrators for one of those. When you put it into an enterprise data layer or an operational data warehouse, you get to minimize that, and it's almost at a ratio that we're seeing of 1 to 7. So for every 7 database administrators you have, when you build the data layer, you can reduce it down to essentially 1, and that's getting extreme costs, because then you also lower the hardware, and it's not just hardware cost and the license fees associated with that, but it's the air conditioning, it's the power, it's the real estate space, which we all know in this area is at a premium.
And so these databases get to be very large as you ingest non-like types of data into, I guess, warehouses, sort of an old-fashioned word, but that's essentially what it is. And as we hear more about use of, say, technologies like solid-state storage, then it increases the speed of delivering that data. So that really opens up a new kind of era in being able to analyze things fast at pretty low operational cost in the data center.
It does. You're absolutely correct. And one of the other things that it gets to is you're not duplicating data. A lot of times with silos, you end up duplicating data over and over again, which exponentially increases your storage that you require. For when you put it into a data layer, you only need one copy of that data. Everybody can access that through secure mechanisms.
Yeah, Gary, what are some of the techniques that you're using to keep storage in some kind of reasonable manner, given the size of the data sets that you have and the constant acquisition of more and more? What are you doing to stay on top of that so that it stays useful?
So that gets back to the cultural issue where every analyst wants to own their data, and we're gradually breaking people of that paradigm and getting them to understand that data at rest makes it far more efficient and effective for our entire workforce to be able to do the analysis that we do. And we've brought on some data stewards who we use to condition our data and to look for duplication of data where we can eliminate that.
And so do you have a governance structure for the data? I imagine somebody's got to decide this is the right way to apply the metadata and so forth.
We do, and we're actually it's a constant evolution for us. We're in what we call our phase 7 of applying our NGA application schema right now, which is the data standards that I was talking about.
How many phases are there yet to go?
We don't know.
So you're just starting at one and keep going?
Yes.
All right, well, we'll explore that more in just a moment, but first we're going to take a short break. Our guests today are Stephen Buckner, the Assistant Director for Communications at the U.S. Census Bureau, Gary Duno, the Director of Analysis at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, Neil Wiley, the Deputy Director for Analysis at the Defense Intelligence Agency, and Dave Rost, the subject matter expert on insider threats at MarkLogic. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. This is Contextual Intelligence, Deciphering Disparate Data in Government, sponsored by MarkLogic on federalnewsradio.com and Federal News Radio 1500 AM.